Good morning. This morning we are in Daniel. We're starting with chapter 6. If you will turn in your Bibles and go along with us, we will study what each verse means. I use the Enduring Word translation, and David Gusick is my main commentator. Verse 1 through 3. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps. Now, satraps are the protectors of the realm. And they were over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. In verse 1, secular history at this period has no record of a ruler named Darius. There are 3 possible explanations for this. Darius was either another name for Cyrus, or Darius was actually Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, or Darius was an ancient official known as Gubaru, which is kind of an unusual name here. So it is the opinion of the commentator that I used, David Gusick, that Gubaru was the same person as Darius, so it's to be the third one. In fact, Darius may be an honorific title, meaning holder of the scepter. So ancient documents show that this man, Gubaru, had the power to make appointments, he could assemble an army, he could level taxes, and he could possess palaces. So Gubaru was, in a very real sense, the king over Babylon. In verse 2, Daniel was one of 3 leaders directly under Darius, and he shined above all the other 2 leaders because he had an excellent spirit about him. He had a good attitude in his work and life, and this made him the object of attacks by the others who were jealous of him and wanted his position. In verse 4 through 9, so the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, "We will not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God." So these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, "King Darius, live forever. All your governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, the governors, counselors, and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be charged or changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter." Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. In verse 4, Daniel was such a faithful man that those who looked for a flaw in his actions or his character came up empty, and that was after being in office for 50 years. You know, sometimes today we have candidates or nominees for a political office, and they're set under scrutiny here, and just imagine looking so hard that you can't find anything in their 50 years of being in service that was wrong. But, you know, no fraudulent accounts, no intern scandals, no questionable business deals, no gifts from lobbyists, no accusations from his staff. But his enemies examined his life and they didn't find anything to attack, so they had to make up something to attack him. And this wasn't to imply that he was a perfect man, but he was a man of great integrity, especially in his professional life. And these men knew Daniel well, and they also knew Darius well. They knew Daniel couldn't be trapped into evil, but they also knew that he would be faithful to his God in all circumstances. So every Christian should consider if others could say the same thing about them. Are you faithful to God in all of your circumstances? They also knew they could appeal to Darius's pride and his desire for a unified kingdom. So the suggested mode of compelling every subject in the former Babylonian domain was to acknowledge the authority of Persia And that seemed to be a good measure that would contribute to the unification of the Middle and Near East that they had conquered. So the time limit was for 1 month. Well, that seemed pretty reasonable to them. But what pretense could they urge for so silly an ordinance here? Probably it was to flatter the king, Darius, and then they would pretend to make him a god for 30 days so that the whole empire should make prayer and supplication to him. And then they could call him with divine honors. They could give him all these honors. But this was the bait, and their real object was to destroy Daniel. So Daniel's enemies knew that people could be persuaded to do things that they would normally do if everybody else was doing them. I know my girls used to say, Mom, can I go so-and-so? And I said, well, who all's going? Well, everybody's going. And then I'd say, well, who is everybody? And it'd be maybe 2 or 3 names here. But of course, they lied when they said all of the governors, because he said they all had consulted together. Well, Daniel was one of the governors, and they had not consulted with him. So they had a lie to begin with. So it's an established principle in the Medo-Persian Empire that when a king formally signed and instituted a decree, that it was so binding that even he himself could not undo it, because he was thought to speak for the gods, and the gods were never wrong. So if you made a decree, they could not change their minds. The gods could not, nor could the king. In verse 10 and 15, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing is true according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. So they answered and said to the king, that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. In verse 10, Daniel was confronted with this test of loyalties. Is he going to be loyal to his king, or is he going to be loyal to the higher king, the King of Kings? And he refused to give the government the measure of obedience that belonged to God alone, as he always had. Others perhaps considered it risky for him to pray, as was his custom. But Daniel knew, the safest thing that he could do was radically obey God. So unless you're prepared to be in the minority, this is by McLaren, and I like it. Unless you are prepared to be in the minority and now and then to be called narrow, fanatic, to be laughed at by men because you will not do what they do, but abstain and resist, then there is little chance of your ever making much of your Christian profession. So we have to stand up for God always. In verse 11, Daniel didn't let this decree change his actions one way or the other. He didn't do more praying or he didn't do less praying. He just simply continued his excellent prayer life. Now there was danger in both directions. If it would be compromise to do less, and it would be pride if he did more. But what was Daniel's custom in prayer? And we see here on the board that he prayed in his upper room. Now this was private prayer. It was not intended to impress anyone. And then, let's see if I can get then he prayed with his windows open toward Jerusalem. And he remembered the place where the sacrifice was made when there wasn't any right now, but there had been sacrifice in Jerusalem. And then he prayed according to the scripture. 1 Kings 8, Solomon asked God to give special notice to the prayers of his people when they prayed toward Jerusalem and the temple. Do you have that scripture in 1 Kings 8:30. And we'll see what Solomon had to say.
And may you hear the supplication of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray towards this place, and hear in heaven your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive.
All right. Then he knelt down on his knees, and Heslop says that if you're on your knees, it is a posture of begging, and we must all come to God as beggars. Then he prayed 3 times a day, knowing that a little prayer is good, but more prayer is even better. And we remember that he was a governor, and so he had a lot of duties, but he still found the time to pray 3 times a day. And then he prayed and he gave thanks. And that's because great prayer is filled with thanksgiving. In verse 11, they found Daniel just as they knew they would, deep in prayer. For Daniel's prayer was both communication with God and then supplication for God's will to be done in all circumstances. So Daniel intended no disrespect for the king, only a higher measure for God. Now, in verse 14, there's a lot to like about King Darius. One of the admirable things about him was that he was displeased with himself. He didn't blame anyone else for this circumstance except for himself. He should have been better at reading what they were trying to say against Daniel, and he knew he was at fault. And we can be sure that he was not happy with the people that brought this statute to him that he signed, but he knew ultimately that he was responsible. So like Darius, our foolish decisions often haunt us. Often all we can do is pray and ask God to mercifully and miraculously intervene when we mess up, when we make foolish decisions, and I do that more than I'd like to. So Darius worked as long as he could, and according to the ancient Eastern custom, the execution was carried out on the same day at the evening time that the accusation was made and found valid. So they didn't wait around years and years before they punished somebody. They did it immediately. Verse 16 through 18. So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, "Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you." Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. In verse 16, Darius had faith, and it was faith born out of Daniel's trust in the Lord. The idea was, I tried my best to save you, Daniel, but I failed. Now it's up to your God, the one who you serve continually. So here we see Daniel in the lion's den up on the board. So the king sealed it, and this may have been to protect Daniel as much as to make sure that someone did not get him out of the den. And Darius knew that Daniel had powerful enemies who might kill him if the lions did not. In verse 18, undoubtedly, Daniel had a better night than Darius did, because it says he did not sleep at all. And we can be sure that Daniel prayed. Here he is in the lion's den, because it was simply his habit to pray. But he did not need to start praying at this remarkable occasion. So many times we kind of drift along in our prayer time, and then when something really bad happens, we really get with it. Well, Daniel didn't have to do that. He prayed 3 times a day diligently all the time, and so he didn't have to make this great prayer time for this occasion. Then in verse 19 through 23, then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" And then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. Then the king was exceedingly glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. In verse 19, since he couldn't sleep, it was easy for Darius to get up in the morning at the first sight of dawn to see how Daniel had fared. And in verse 20 and 21, when he heard Daniel's voice, he knew that he had survived through the night. Now the lions would not or could not touch this servant of God. And we don't know if Daniel saw an angel or not, but he certainly knew that God sent his angel to rescue him. Ronnie, would you read Hebrews 1:14? It talks about angels.
Are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to minister for those who will inherit salvation?
All right, so God sent these angels to serve Daniel's needs. Now, Daniel did break the law, but he did not go against the king or against the king's best interest. So he is an example of obedient disobedience. So he was obedient to God, but he's disobedient to the law. But he was preserved through faith, and his cause was righteous, and he was unjustly accused. So there is an instructive here. The power of God sent an angel to protect Daniel in response to the prayer of faith from a consistent abiding walk that he had with his God. In verse 3, because of his faith, Daniel is recognized in Hebrews 11:33. So would you read that, please?
Who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions.
Okay, so the mouths of lions were stopped, and that's found in Hebrews. Verse 24, and the king gave the command, and they brought these men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives, and the lions overpowered them, and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. No one had ever asked Darius to this. Nobody had to ask him either. He was ready and willing to bring justice to those who had plotted against Daniel, and also to their children and their wives. Now, this was really severe, but it was according to the ancient customs among the Persians. The laws were formidable, and by which, on account of the guilt of one person, all of their kin would die also. So Darius was not happy with these men, and so that's why he did this. The lions overpowered them, and this proved that it was genuinely an angel that had saved Daniel. And it proved that there was no natural reason why the lions should not have killed him. They were hungry. So Daniel's accusers perished in the same way that they wanted to kill Daniel. And this illustrates this principle of spiritual warfare. God will cause our enemy to be caught in the same snare that they try to set for us. So a related question is, where was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego during all of these events? They're not mentioned. And so one point is, well, maybe they had deceased by that time. Maybe they were no longer alive. The second thing is that his three friends also violated this statute by the king, and they continued to pray, but they weren't caught. And the reason they weren't caught, they weren't looking for them. They were looking for Daniel to get caught. In verse 25 through 28, then King Darius wrote, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all of the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one that shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in the heaven and on earth. Who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions? So This Daniel proposed in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian, and he prospered. Now, we have here on the board, the book of Daniel follows this familiar pattern. God's people stand in their convictions, and then God honors and protects them. And then the testimony of God's work makes the ungodly see and tell of the greatness of God. So first, Daniel and his 3 friends stood firm. Nebuchadnezzar saw the fruit of it. Daniel boldly and wisely interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and the king honored Daniel and his God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood firm, and Nebuchadnezzar gave glory to God. Then Daniel boldly told Nebuchadnezzar the truth, and the king humbled himself and gave glory to God. Daniel stood firm and boldly told Belshazzar the truth, and the king honored Daniel. So all these things had already happened. So the point is clear. When we stand firm in our convictions and honor God, even when it costs us something to do so, others will see that testimony and they will be impressed. So Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus. So that's the end of chapter 6. Are there any questions or comments on that one?
The king must have really loved him.
I'm telling you, to be in a den of lions would be something.
Yeah.
And then to be delivered.
And for the king to be up all night and just really wrestling with this whole thing, and again, to be angry, to throw all their families and their wives.
I know. I suppose it really taught people that you better watch out. If you get accused and found guilty, then everybody in your family will be killed with you.
Wow.
A harsh law. So this is now part 4 of the visions, and it's the visions of Daniel in chapter 7. It starts. So I have here. Okay, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told us the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. See if I need another. No, that's all. Okay, so this vision came to Daniel after the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, but before the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Medo-Persian Empire. So here we see that it's not in chronological order. This actually should come between chapter 4 and 5, while Nebuchadnezzar was still king. And so this first vision, one of the 4, was the most comprehensive, and the other 3 visions go into greater detail within the general framework of this first vision. So Daniel could have given us more detail, but the Holy Spirit only wanted him to write the main facts. So in verse 2, this was almost certainly the Mediterranean Sea that he saw. Each one of the empires mentioned in his vision had geographical connection with the Mediterranean Sea. The idea is of chaos and turmoil. And to the Hebrews, the sea was both very dangerous and mysterious, and it was a restless element that could only be calmed by God. The sea is sometimes called a picture of the Gentile nations, and in imagery it stands for the populace, the mindless, unorganized mass of mankind. So some see these winds that they talk about here as a description of the sovereign power of God striving with men, and others see the 4 winds as satanic forces. But there were 4 large, ferocious animals that emerged from the great sea. One was distinct from the other. Verse 4. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. And then verse 5, behold, on the board here, another beast, a second one like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, arise, devour much flesh. And then the next verse, 6, after this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back, and the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Now we see this first beast, and this is what one of the people saw as the way it looked, as a lion with wings up here on the board. And the first beast was more majestic than any of the following beasts. The lions and eagles are kings in their own realm here. But this majestic beast was humbled. The wings were plucked off, and it was made a human with a human's heart that had been given to it. Daniel tells us that these 4 beasts are the 4 kingdoms ruling over the earth. The first kingdom is the Babylonian kingdom, and it was represented by the lion and the eagle. And this fits well with that majesty and authority that Nebuchadnezzar had in his reign over the empire of Babylon. And that we saw in Jeremiah. And Babylon's winged lions can still be seen at the British Museum today. So we know that they looked something like this. The second beast didn't have the majestic bearing of either of the lion or the eagle. It was a bear. It was slower, but it was stronger and more crushing than a lion. And this bear had a voracious appetite for conquest. He was told to arise and to devour much flesh. The bear represented the Medo-Persian Empire, which took over the Babylon Empire. And in this partnership between the Medes and the Persians was the dominant of the relationship. Most think that the 3 ribs that this bear has in its mouth represent the 3 great military conquests, Babylon, Egypt, and Lydia. Now, the slow crushing armies of the Medo-Persian Empire were well known, and they were simply, all they did was they overwhelmed their opponents with superior size and strength. So the Medes and Persians were compared to a bear on account of their cruelty and their thirst for blood, a bear being the most voracious and cruel animal. The command to arise and devour much flesh indicates the extreme cruelties that were often practiced by the Persian people and the wide extent of their conquest. Now, liberal commentators here have interest in identifying the bear only with the Median state, and then they did not combine the Medo-Persian Empire, and then they assigned the third beast to just the Persian Empire, and then the fourth to Alexander's great empire. So they don't remove any prophet, they just remove the prophecy out of all of this. So their analysis does not fit. In verse 6, we see this leopard was known for its sudden and unexpected attacks here. And this one was very swift. It had 4 wings, and it was very clever because it had 4 heads. Each animal is mighty and dominates its prey in a different way. The lion devours, the bear crushes, and the leopard springs upon his prey. So the leopard represented the Greek Empire. Alexander the Great quickly conquered all of the civilized world, and he was only 28 years old when he did that. And nothing in the history of the world was equal to the conquest of Alexander. He ran all through the countries of Illyricum and the Adriatic Sea to the Indian Ocean to the river Ganges. And in just 12 years, he subdued part of Europe and all of Asia. So after his death, his empire was divided into 4 parts. These 4 heads here that are seen here. Specifically, the 4 heads were Cassandra, Lysippus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. And they inherited Alexander's domain after his death. So the Babylonian Empire dominated in Daniel's day, and one might have guessed, especially in the reign of Belshazzar, that the next empire would be the Medo-Persian Empire because it had gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. But how could Daniel know that the next world empire would be the leopard in its rise in prominence and that it would be divided into 4 different parts? He couldn't have known. So this shows that plain principle that God knows the future, and he reveals certain details of the future through his prophets. He knows the future, he knows the present, he knows the past. So the proof is the fulfilled prophecy here that Daniel gave. It's very persuasive. So after this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful, and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So if you count the horns on it, there they are. Let me go to the next one. So I considered the horns, and behold, there came up amongst them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So this, in verse 7, this 4th beast was indescribable. It was a horrible beast. It was very powerful and fearsome. Different people picture this in different ways. Some suggest that the 10 horns are actually like 2 antlers with 5 horns on each, or 5 prongs from each of there. But most say no, it had 10 horns like this, and they were separate. In the historical fulfillment, the 4th beast represents the Roman Empire. It was the largest, it was the strongest, it's the one that lasted the longest. And there is an unmistakable correspondence between these horns and the 10 toes of the dream figure of Nebuchadnezzar. Among the 10 horns, 3 are replaced, and then I've got it circled up here. These 3 right here are replaced by this one horn. It has eyes like a man and a mouth like a man. Except those don't look like a man, but they are there. So these 3 horns are replaced by one horn that was conspicuous for its dominance before these 3 horns were plucked out by the roots. So it had intelligence, it had eyes like a man, and it had boastful talk. It spoke pompous words. So the vision is at the end of the Gentile world dominion. The former Roman Empire will have 10 horns, corresponding to the 10 toes of the image. And there rises up among them this little horn here. And it subdues 3 of the kings so completely that the separate identity of their kingdoms is destroyed. Now, the 7 kings of the 10 are left, and then we have the little horn. And he is the king of fierce countenance, typified by that other king of fierce countenance, which is Antiochus Epiphanes, the prince that's going to come. He's the king, the abominator, the man of sin, and the beast. All right, so the next one is, as I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire is issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. In verse 9, the King James Version doesn't translate the thrones right. In the King James, it says the thrones were cast down. Here it says the thrones were placed, and that is really what happened. So when the Apostle John saw the thrones in heaven, what he saw were the thrones with the 24 elders sitting up on them. And he also saw those who sat on the thrones. And in the Old Testament, he would not have seen these because it had not happened yet. So that's why he just saw the thrones here. The Ancient of Days is obviously God. And there's a debate, is he really God the Father or is he God the Son? But we think that he is God the Father. And then he has white garments and he has white hair, and that speaks of the eternal character of God the Father. In verse 10, it says his throne was a fiery flame. And this was a brilliant manifestation of God's splendor and the fierce heat of his judgment. Now, there seems to be something lava-like in the stream of fire that's flowing from his throne. It was like a river of destructive power, actually. So would you read Isaiah 66, 15 through 16? This describes the judgment of God in terms of fire.
For behold, the Lord will come with fire, and with his chariots like a whirlwind, to render his anger with fury and his rebuke with flames of fire. For by fire and by his sword the Lord will judge all flesh, and the slain of the Lord shall be many.
All right, so many commentators say that in the ancient Eastern world, royal thrones were on wheels, and yet it's just as likely that they might represent the endless activity of God, that is always, God's always active. Verse 10, 1,000 thousands. This describes the innumerable company of angels that surround the throne of God. Then the 10,000 times 10,000, this describes humanity standing before the judgment seat of God. Now, it talks about books being opened, and the Bible describes several books before God, and any of these or any combination of these could be meant. This first book of the living, out of Psalm 69:28, it says, "Let them be blotted out of the book of the living and not be written with the righteous." The second book is the book of remembrance. It's in Malachi 3:16. "And a book of remembrance was written before him for them that feared the Lord and thought upon his name." The third book is the book of life. It's in Revelation 13:8. "And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of the life of the Lamb." So they're going to worship the Antichrist here in this one. Now, in verse 11 through 14, "I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. And as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, and their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I looked then because of the sound of the great words of the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, and their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like the Son of Man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is as everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that should not be destroyed." In verse 12, they had their dominion taken away. So this great passage describes the transition from human dominion on earth to divine dominion. This is when we go into the millennium. And this happens when the Son of Man comes and he takes dominion over the earth. So the Son of Man succeeds the reign of that fourth beast. And here the little horn of the fourth beast again speaks pompous words. The final human dictator we commonly call the Antichrist will be characterized by his boastful, blasphemous words. And because of the distinction between the fourth beast and the horn, some conjecture that the beast is not the Antichrist, but it's the government or the administration that he's over. But it doesn't make any difference. It's the same thing, the beast and his administration. And to a large extent, men represent and personify the entire kingdom or system that they're over. So the fourth beast is destroyed, and the others may continue, but they're not going to have any dominion of their own. When Jesus sets up his kingdom, the empire of the Antichrist will be completely crushed, and yet some nations will continue into the millennium. The title Son of Man was a favorite self-designation of Jesus, and it appears more than 80 times just in the 4 Gospels. So the scene is identical with that of Revelation 5, 6 through 10, and there the praise of the king and priest ends with the words, "And we shall reign on the earth." So the vision reverses the order of events as they will be fulfilled. So again, we find some reversal here in the scripture, and it precedes the events which Daniel sees in the vision, and here's what the order really should be like. The first thing that happens is the givings of honors to the Son of Man with the kingdom. So he gets the kingdom. Then we have the vexing, which is unexplained trouble. Then we have the return of the Son of Man in glory to deliver the smiting blow of the stone cut out of the mountain without hands that broke the statue. Then we have the judgment of the nations and the setting up of the kingdom. Jesus receives all dominion previously held by the beast, and their reign, his reign, is going to be permanent, where theirs was not. The reign of Jesus does not last 100 years. It lasts forever and ever. It's eternal, permanent. However, Jesus will rule over the earth before it is remade, and that will be for 1,000 years when Satan is bound. Now, verse 15 through 18. I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near to one of those who stood by and asked him the truth of all of this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. This is a summary of the vision. 4 kings are conquered by God, and their kingdoms are given to the people of God. Those great beasts, which are 4 kings which arise out of the earth, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. In verse 15, Daniel saw all of this, and he saw it more in detail than what he actually wrote, and he didn't really understand it all. But he was troubled because of his lack of understanding. And this shows that our spirit indeed dwells within the body. And it's true that the spirit is more important than the body, but sometimes the body is affected by the spirit. In verse 17 and 18, the divine interpretation of the dream shows that this vision covers the same material as Nebuchadnezzar's vision. So here we have the 2 Nebuchadnezzar's dream by itself, and then we compare them with Daniel's dream. So here in Nebuchadnezzar's, we had Babylon the Great. He was the lion, the Chaldean dynasty, and it was King Nebuchadnezzar. The Silver Age, which is this part, was the Achaemenid Empire. It was the bear, it was the Median and the Persians. King Cyrus the Great was the ruler. The Bronze Age was Greco-Macedonia, it was the leopard, it was Alexander the Great. And then we had the Iron Age, which is this part down here, which was the beast, which was western and eastern part of the country, and it was reigned by the Caesars. Then we had the Modern Age, which was the new. It was the Roman Empire with the 10 kings and kingdoms. This has not come true. And some say they don't know that it will even come true. And then we have the New World Order, which is to come. Now over here, we have Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the gold head. In Daniel's dream, it was the lion, and the kingdom was Babylon. The silver was the breast and arms. In Daniel's, it was the bear, and it was Persia. In Nebuchadnezzar's, it was the brass, the belly, and the thighs. In Daniel's, it was the leopard, and it was Greece that took over the world. And then in Nebuchadnezzar's, it was the iron, the legs, had the beast with 10 horns, and this was in Daniel's, and it was the Roman Empire. Then we have the iron and clay, which is the feet and the toes. And Daniel's dream, it was the 10 horns and another horn. And this is the Antichrist system. Then we have the rock, which strikes the feet. This was the Son of Man in Daniel's dream. And this is when Christ reigns in Daniel's dream. Any questions about that? Okay. Let's see. So here we see Jesus. He is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And he is primarily represented as a ferocious animal, like the lion, but he is himself depicts himself as a lamb. All right. So when the day of the fourth beast is over, then God's people receive the kingdom. And yet we know that the Roman kingdom, though long gone, and it doesn't seem like the saints have received that kingdom, that we don't have the 10 new kingdoms of the Roman Empire. And this is what many prompt them to look at, that maybe it was a spiritualized illustration fulfilled in history, or some kind of restoration of the Roman Empire in the last days that may be fulfilled before God comes back or Jesus comes back in the last days. So in verse 18, the saints receive the kingdom, and God gives them the kingdom at the return of Jesus. And they do not gain dominion over all of these earthly kingdoms before the return of Jesus. And I think we'll stop there. It's getting late, and so we will take up there. But are there any questions or comments on